You are listening to Demystifying Organizations. In partnership with McGraw-Hill Education, I'm your host, Jeff Schatten. Before we get started with today's guest, just a note, if you have questions or comments, you can email me at jeffschatten1@gmail.com. You can tweet me at Jeff Schatten. If you like this podcast, press the subscribe button and make sure to rate it on iTunes so that other people can find it. My guest today is Henry Mintzberg, an internationally renowned academic and author on business and management. He is currently a full professor at McGill University in Montreal. Mintzberg earned his PhD in management from MIT in 1968. Henry Mintzberg writes prolifically on topics of management and business strategy, with more than 150 articles and 15 books to his name. His seminal book, The Rise and Fall of Strategic Planning, criticizes some of the practices of strategic planning today. I'm honored to have him on the podcast to discuss his new book, Bedtime Stories for Managers. All right, I'd like to welcome to the podcast Henry Mintzberg. I'm so glad to have you here.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I'm happy to be here.
It's an honor to have you. I studied you throughout your work throughout my own graduate studies, and I'm just glad to have you on the podcast to be discussing your new book.
Good.
So it's a very funny book. It's interesting. It's engaging. I'll say it's one of the very few management books that I read that I find myself laughing. But there's a lot of serious points, and you raise some indictments on many of the things that we think of as management scholars. So I want to get right to it. The first thing that you really take issue with, or one of the things that you take issue with over and over, is kind of the Kotter model of top-down leadership. Right. So the leadership construct, as it's taught in most business schools, is very much top-down focused, right? CEO heavy. The CEO, a new CEO, should come in and just change up the organization. And you take issue with that. Can you just lay out some of your arguments that you make against top-down leadership?
What I say often is that an effective organization is a community of human beings. It's not a collection of human resources. Leadership is important. Management is important. The whole book is about management. But this idea of what I call lofty leadership, somehow that leaders sit above and look down on the whole organization, I think is just dysfunctional. You mentioned Kotter, but Kotter's largely a popularizer, and Kotter is really just carrying forward the whole Harvard Business School view. Harvard thinks it trains chief executives. There's some evidence in the book that it does that badly, and therefore, everything focuses on that person. And Kotter's well known for a model of transformation. But that model is, every single step of that model is top, leader. It's as if nobody exists in the organization except to carry out what one person thinks should get done. And
so given all that, what's the role of a leader or of a CEO? Given your disagreement with some of the top-down views.
Well, let me split CEOs into two. One are CEOs who, in fact, don't often go to business schools or Harvard or places like that. I'm talking about Steve Jobs and people who created Google and Amazon, and I don't know what his education is, but they're typically not.
The Google guys are PhDs from Stanford.
Yeah, and
an engineer.
Bezos is what, an engineer?
I'm not sure.
At Amazon, I don't know, but they're it's a different kind, and their leadership is critically important because they're constructing from scratch and they're coming up with a vision of what the organization should be. But the irony is that it's not MBA training that enables people to do that. MBAs typically, when they become chief executives of established organizations. Very often they replace leaders only for the leaders to come back, only for the entrepreneurs to come back and realize what they're doing to the organization. So I'm talking about established organizations, and what's critical in established organizations is the building of community, the sense of people are in it together, the sense that ideas can come from anywhere, and it's not about one person. And so on. The other thing about leadership is the word means a person. The leadership doesn't refer to multiple people. Leadership refers to a person or multiple leaders in the sense of several single persons. Einstein was a leader, but he wasn't a chief executive, if you like. And this isn't the way organizations work when they're really, really effective. They work when people are engaged, and the job of its chief executive is to enhance that engagement and to encourage the conditions that enhance that sense of community in the organization. And thinking you're on top and you're the lofty leader does exactly the opposite.
Right. So one of the things that makes it most essential is psychological safety, right? So when leaders are more open to the input of others, then people feel more psychologically safe. So it's a concept that, right, just to give kind of an overview. So psych safety is to the extent to which within a team or within a group, people who are lower down feel comfortable raising objections to somebody who's a superior or raising new ideas.
Yeah, in a way, but I wouldn't quite put it open to the ideas of others. I would put it, create a structure, create an organization that's open to the ideas of everyone. In other words, it's not about convincing the boss. It's about sending ideas through an organization in a robust culture that accepts ideas and spreads them around. It's obviously going to end up with a chief executive who sprinkles holy water on it and puts the budgets together and all that. But it's not just about that person. It's about an open culture, not just open leader, that's part of it, but an open culture.
There's a great letter that you kind of invent. I'm just going to read a section of it. It's called A CEO's Letter to the Board, Long Overdue. Dear directors, and then it goes on, you are now paying me so much that I can no longer manage this company as I should. I hereby request that you cut my salary substantially and eliminate all of my bonuses. First of all, it's very funny. Second is that so what are you trying to get at with this letter about the relationship? It's got some sarcasm in it, but it gets us to some deep rifts between the incentives of a CEO or of an executive versus that of the board of shareholders. What are you trying to get at with that letter?
Well, partly the same issue, which is this idea that somehow I'm separate from everybody else. And, you pay me 400 times as much as everybody else because I'm 400 times more important than anybody else. That's part of what I'm getting at. And the other thing I'm trying to get at is that the short-term incentives are dysfunctional, and I defy anyone to come up with long-term incentives because, if I'm the chief executive, I'll be long gone. And if things go badly, I'll blame it on the guy who followed me or the woman who followed me. And if things go well, the person who followed me would be saying, well, why are you giving that person the bonuses? I'm really responsible for what's been happening. So you can't do it. You can't do it. It just doesn't work.
So some of this is that, right? So most corporations, at least publicly traded ones, are evaluated on a quarterly basis. And so every 3 months, they basically have to show their report card for investments that ought to take, 5 years or 7 years to pay off.
Yeah, it's nuts. It's absolutely nuts. Quarterly earnings should be gotten rid of. I was visiting Denmark recently. All the major companies, or almost all the major companies in Denmark, like Lego and Carlsberg and so on, are controlled by trusts. They control the voting shares, so they don't have to kowtow to stock analysts who are telling them to do ridiculous things. Tata, the biggest, I think it's the biggest, or one of the biggest companies in India, amazing company. Same thing, it's controlled by family trusts. There's publicly traded shares, but they don't control the voting. So a lot of these organizations found a way around this madness, and they do very well.
What are some of the other things that you would do to limit the short-termism of executive foresight?
Well, selection is a big issue, I think. One of the points I make in one of the stories is that we should select managers for their faults as much as for their, by managers, I mean chief executives and all the others. We should select managers for their faults as much as for their qualities. And the faults of many chief executives these days is narcissism. They think they're the be all and end all of everything, and they're not necessarily team players who build up effective organizations. Some do, too many don't. And, you can spoil an organization in no time. It really doesn't take much to spoil an organization. Look at Delta Airlines, that was revered for the way it treated people. And then all of a sudden, it reversed completely. Now it's come back, apparently. We put too much into the power of single individuals.
I'd like to turn our attention just to a current event, which I so just the past couple of days there was a second accident with one of the Boeing planes, and one of the things that struck me about this, and there's the tragedy of it, but how little Boeing is accountable to these deaths because of market forces. So Boeing's in a duopoly with Airbus, and as of today, their stock is down by 11% since the accident, and it's only about 11% because they're in a duopoly with Airbus. And if you're an airline, the only ones that you can buy from are Airbus and Boeing, and Airbus already has multi-year waits. So the hit to Boeing is relatively limited given the scope of the damage, right? Because of the structure of this duopoly, there's no other place to go.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's the nature of that business, because the investments and the bets that you make on building an airplane are so massive. I'm from Montreal, and Bombardier tried to compete at one end of that and found it very difficult. But the shocking thing about this, I guess, I'm not party to the details, but the shocking thing about this is that after the first one, it was quite clear that something was seriously wrong. And it took a second one to wake people up, which is really shocking. And I suspect Boeing's going to pay one hell of a price for that, because they're not going to stand up in a court of law and say, yeah, well, we needed two accidents to fix this.
Right. And part of that is that from my understanding, it's an over-reliance on the machine algorithms that are supposed to fly the planes, as opposed to the human intuition part. And that those two seem to have been at odds with one another.
By the way, there was a great comment by the head of the Airline Pilots Association years ago. He said, in the future, all cockpits will have one pilot and one dog. And the pilot is there to look after the dog, and the dog is there to bite the pilot if he tries to touch anything.
So one of the things that you write about that's really interesting is part of the problems of hard data. So we have this idea that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And it's the quantification of pretty much everything that businesses try to touch. And you address some of the problems. Can you go into what are some of the issues with the kind of obsession with management and hard data?
Well, for one thing, some of the most interesting things in companies just don't lend themselves to measurement. Nobody has ever measured the effectiveness of a manager. Bottom line doesn't measure the effectiveness of a chief executive, as we just discussed. So, who can measure leadership? Who can measure culture? Who can measure communityship? Or my favorite example is whoever measured measurement, whoever proved measurement. Whoever proved the measurement is better. We can't even measure the potential for a new product. A really new product. People always get it wrong. Sometimes they're delighted how they get it wrong. The old story of Procter and Gamble with the Pampers. They never dreamed people would use it at home. They got it wrong. Very hard to measure the potential for a new product. So if you're obsessed with measurement, you're pathological.
One of my favorite things or maybe even least favorite things that I come across is I've sat through a bunch of startup pitches where they project out. Mind you, this is usually 2 or 3 or 4 people. They have a website. They might have a basic product, and they present financial projections going 5 years out, and inevitably, it's
$100 million in revenue or $10 million in revenue for this thing that doesn't even exist.
Yeah.
And I say, well, how did you get to that? And the answer always is, well, this is what Excel said.
Excel must be very smart.
Excel's really smart. It's the number that it popped out.
It's amazing how people get sucked in by this. Of course, some people aren't sucked in by this. They're just playing the game, which is if other people are going to believe it, I'll invest in it because they'll up the price of the stock and I'll get out. So in a way,
a greater fool theory.
Yeah. You don't have to guess where the company's going to be. You have to guess where people think the company is going to be.
Right. You talk a little bit about the difference between efficiency and things that are more core. So could you comment about how you view the obsession with the efficiency?
Yeah, if you say efficiency, people don't, efficiency is the greatest bang for the buck, right? Whatever bang you want, you get more of it for the buck. But that's not the way we actually use efficiency. I ask people what they think when I say a restaurant is efficient, and almost all of them say it's fast. I ask people what it means if I say my house is efficient. Almost everybody says fuel consumption. Now, whoever bought a house for fuel consumption? And how often do you go to a restaurant just for speed of service? So what we're doing is zeroing in subconsciously on what's measurable. Okay?
Right.
And what's measurable is often not what's most important. We can't measure quality, for example.
Right, and efficiency is something that you can quantify, right? That's you can cut jobs easily. You can improve service time, and then you can report that back. You can say service time for X widget was 30 minutes, now it's 28 minutes, and you can represent that as an improvement. I mean, there are things on the out.
I was going to say, if you cut R&D, you can show right away the cost savings. But nobody can show what's going to happen to the company in the future because you cut R&D. So what you're doing is cutting measurable costs at the expense of immeasurable benefits.
So what do you advocate instead of a focus on efficiency?
You get on the ground, you watch what's going on, you watch how customers shop, you use the products yourself. I fantasize, never get a chance to do this. I fantasize that I can sit down with the chief executive of a company that makes a juice I drink, and it's unopenable. And I say, let's have some juice. I say, let's have some juice. And he said, good, we'll get you some juice. And I say, here, you open it. And he'd fire the guy in the factory. And I'd say, no, you should fire yourself. You're just as responsible. I love the story of John Cleghorn. I sit in the Cleghorn chair at McGill, and John was the president of the chief executive of the Royal Bank of Canada. One day on the way to the airport, he called the head office and said an ATM wasn't working at a particular place. And he became famous for that. And why is John doing that? Is he supposed to be reporting all the broken ATM machines? No, he's setting an example that everybody should be doing that.
Right. So this addresses some of the top-down issues, right? So if you're not on the 30th floor, you're going through all the different floors as well as talking to customers and using the product yourself.
Yeah. Well, get rid of all those floors and make it flat. People don't like to go up the stairs, but they'll walk a mile on a flat ground, but they won't go up the stairs. It becomes the inner sanctum up there, them up there,
So how do you do that in a very large organization? If there's 20,000 employees, so just to contrast it, it'd be pretty easy at a company of 50 people to make it pretty flat, where the CEO and president is seen walking around and engaging and interacting. How do you do it at a larger scale to make it where the C-level suite is not up there and holier than thou?
Well, it depends what you're doing, but 20,000 people is, depending on the business you're in, might be 500 or 5,000 teams, and it comes down to a smaller scale at some point. So there's ways to do that. But if you're in the retail business and you're, let's say, Apple, you don't have to go into every single Apple store to know how the stores are functioning. You can visit some of them and you get a sense of it. You don't have to be in every single one. And the story of John Cleghorn is one phone call nobody face-to-face, and everybody in the company knew that John had called the headquarters about this ATM machine.
Right. Can you talk for a minute about, you mentioned it earlier in our conversation, about some of the problems with the Harvard MBA model and maybe business education more broadly?
Well, you can't create a manager in a classroom. Management is not a profession, and it's not a science. It's a practice. And so, like swimming, you don't learn swimming in a classroom. You can learn the hydraulics or whatever in a classroom, but you can't learn swimming in a classroom. Medicine is a profession, so you can learn a lot before you practice, but even then you've got to practice. So management is learned on the job. And taking young people who've never managed and giving them the impression that they've learned how to manage is simply unacceptable. It's they should be stamped with a skull and crossbones that say, "Warning, not prepared to manage," because they don't know anything about management being in that kind of a situation. Or if they do the usual trajectory and go from Harvard or Stanford or wherever to McKinsey and then or to Wall Street or whatever, and then make their way to the chief executive's job directly. Some of them do well. Gerstner was one IBM who did well through that route. Most of them don't do well through that route. They've just learned the wrong way. So MBA programs are great for learning finance and marketing and the functions, but they're anathema for learning management. And if people think they were coming out prepared to manage, they're a danger to society. So
So wouldn't it be the case that expose students to big ideas and to get them to think critically about them, hopefully backed up by some kind of data, right? So instead of more like the liberal arts, like a version of the liberal arts where the end goal involves critical thinking and grappling with complexity and trying to understand challenging scenarios. And I'll just give you some pushback. Would that be a model that you would get behind, or feel free to completely disagree with what I just said?
I completely agree with it for the bachelor's level, because people are not coming out of bachelor's programs thinking they're prepared to manage. So teaching them how to think and teaching them how to look at big issues and grappling with complexities, you say, it's great at the undergraduate level, because they should be trained to think and trained to be critical and so on. That's great. At the MBA level, I think if you want to train managers, you do what we've done in our IMPM.org program, the International Masters Program for Managers. It's for managers, and we build it all on their own experience. Harvard was running an ad for executive development some years ago that showed an executive-looking woman saying, we do 4 cases a year. This is not theory. This is experience. And I say, this is nonsense. It's not experience. It's nonsense. What experience do you have reading a case about somebody else? If you're a manager, you've lived your own cases. You've lived your own experiences. Use those as the basis for the classroom. Drop in our theories, drop in our concepts, drop in our big ideas, sure, 50% of the time. The other 50% is over to them based on their experience, sitting at round tables and discussing, what can we do with this view of strategy? What can we do with this criticism of leadership? How do we make communityship come alive? In terms of my job and what I'm doing and how I compare it with your job and what you're doing. It's very, very, very powerful. But go try and convince any business school. Boy,
to abandon the case method. Yeah. So what would you do with somebody they have 2 or 3 years of work experience, they're 24 years old and in an MBA program, so they're not they are who they are coming in. How would you structure their learning if you can't do the kind of international program that you run?
Well, first of all, they could wait. They could become managers and then do it, and it would be a lot more effective than doing it at 24, 26, or 28 years old. But the other thing they can do is look at this as technical training for technical jobs. You're learning how to be a financial analyst or a marketing researcher or whatever. But of course, we don't want all these technocrats in senior jobs. Some of them are okay. Too many of them are not okay. These are the ones who walk around saying, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it.
Yeah. And just some of your other thoughts. At the end, you give a pretty strong appeal to what I would call conscious capitalism, or one of those related hot button names. What are your thoughts on more the progressive side of economic theory, like conscious capitalism? If you could just first define those conscious capitalism area.
Yeah, I snuck into the book some views that come from another book called Rebalancing Society about the fact that we're out of whack. And a lot of the things I talk about in the book, this lofty leadership and measurement obsession and so on, is part of why we're out of whack. But the other part of it is that we're not balanced across our public and private sectors and what I call plural sectors, or civil society, or NGOs, or not-for-profits. A healthy society balances the three of them. And we're way, way out of balance on the side of one of them. And the populist solution in the US, especially, but much of the world, on the side of private sectors. And, the US is no more balanced than the communist nations were. The communist nations were unbalanced on the side of the public sector. The US and lots of other countries are unbalanced on the side of the private sector, and it's not proving any better. It's not that bad yet, but it's on that way. The populist solution in the United States is what I call adjectival capitalism, and I got a collection of about 10 of them. One is conscious capitalism, democratic capitalism, this capitalism, that capitalism. It's just everybody's got their own form of capitalism. And we're not going to fix society by fixing capitalism. Capitalism needs to be fixed, but society needs to be fixed by putting capitalism in its place. And what's its place? It's the marketplace. And out of the public space, out of the public place. Companies are much too deeply involved with the political process. And, in the US, it's off the scale completely with the gun manufacturers, with the pharmaceutical companies. I mean, they're all, what the Supreme Court did with Citizens United decision was they legalized bribery. You can bribe Congress to your heart's content. And, when I go to Brazil, I say, which country is more corrupt, Brazil or the US? And I say, I'll give you a hint, it's not Brazil. In Brazil, the corruption is criminal, and they're dealing with it. They have been dealing with it. We'll see about the new guy. In the US, the corruption is legal. They can't deal with it. The Supreme Court legalized bribery. And the US democracy is collapsing as a consequence.
Yeah, I'm struck by the amount, the changes that Citizens United has brought about. The ability to have complete and unlimited spending by a corporation in whatever capacity that they want, and where that tilts the power is definitely unnerving for our democracy. How would you want to see those areas rebalanced?
Well, for one thing, you got to reverse Citizens United, but whether this Supreme Court will do that, I'm sure Roberts must have family and friends and so on who let him know what he's done, but what he's done is abhorrent. This whole idea that corporations are persons, which is what facilitated that decision or led to that decision, that was a decision by the Supreme Court. Sorry, it was not a decision. It was in a ruling by the Supreme Court in about 1870, where they didn't discuss whether corporations are persons. They assumed it. It was a clerk who wrote that into their decision. They assumed it. It's never been discussed. So somebody could take a case to the Supreme Court saying corporations are not persons. Of course, again, you got this Supreme Court. So good luck.
All right. Well, on that note, I think we will say goodbye on our conversation. I really thank you so much for joining me. This has been amazing and a big honor.
Thank you, Jeffrey. For me too. It's very nice, good questions and great discussion.
Thanks for listening to the podcast today. If you have any questions or comments, you can email me at jeffschatten1@gmail.com. You can tweet me at Jeff Schatten. If you like this podcast, press the subscribe button and make sure to rate it on iTunes so that other people can find it.